My name is Joy, and I'm from Bloomberg NEF, covering carbon markets in Asia Pacific. And I'm really glad to be able to share this plenary with everyone to talk about carbon markets in Southeast Asia, which is really a topic that has been gaining the limelight in recent years. Carbon markets in Southeast Asia has the potential to generate a lot of revenue and also advance decarbonization in the region. We have seen carbon credits trading in Southeast Asia as high as $45 per ton. And at the same time, we also have significant nature-based abatement potential. So Bloomberg NEF also found that collectively 9 Southeast Asian markets have 1.27 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent in nature-based potential. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities. There's also a lot of risk. So how can we, as one Southeast Asia, actually have sustainable supply as well as grow our demand for carbon credits? And so today, very glad and honored to have our wonderful panelists. So I'm just going to dive right in. The theme of this plenary is advancing collaboration in carbon markets in Southeast Asia. So Dr. Renat, I'm going to go to you first. Could you give us some context? What is the main motivation of collaborating on carbon markets in our region?
Yeah, for sure. So this year, when Malaysia actually took over the ASEAN chairmanship, there were sort of 12 key priorities that have been highlighted. One of them being, to set up and grow the carbon market ecosystem. It's one of the 12 key priority deliverables under the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. So we came together, myself, Dr. Waini, as a small team. We set up a whole consortium of 9 founding members of the Malaysian Carbon Market Association. And then we started going on a pilgrimage, if you like, right, to different ASEAN countries, starting with Thailand, Kun Glaita. We went to her and asked her specifically, you have formed the Thai Carbon Markets Club, you've brought an ecosystem of close to about 1,000, different members. What exactly are your pain points in terms of being able to grow the carbon markets in Thailand? And likewise, we visited Indonesia as well. So that's where we met Dr. Riza, Ria from the ASEAN Carbon Market Alliance. And one of the things that we realized was everybody had a common set of challenges. There's not enough supply of high integrity credits. At the same time, there are also issues around demand, which is very important because without strong demand, right, like who really wants to embark onto developing carbon credits? At the same time, there are also issues around market infrastructure. So we talk a lot about the bottlenecks of not being able to trade carbon credits, right, across the region. And because of that, we felt very strongly that if we were just to focus in Malaysia alone, maybe liquidity isn't going to be enough, right? And liquidity begets liquidity. So that was where we came up with the idea of the ASEAN Common Carbon Framework. How do we actually bind, everything together? We have a common set of challenges, but we also have strengths that we can leverage on, right, among ASEAN members. And, just to sum it all, I think essentially we're trying to address the supply and demand issue. We're trying to allow for interoperability of market infrastructure and also to build capacity building while we are at it. And why is it so important? Because when we first set up the Malaysian Carbon Market Association, we immediately became a call center. Like a lot of people were reaching out to us saying that, they've got 10 durian trees in their orchard, their backyard, can they actually claim carbon credits, right? So it took a lot of education, a lot of hand-holding maybe at the start of the journey to be able to get people up to speed and understanding how the whole carbon markets actually work. And so, you sort of fast-track to today. We have actually formed an ACCF, the ASEAN Common Carbon Framework Steering Committee. Malaysia, of course, is chairing it currently. But I think the whole idea or intention is to eventually pass it on to the next ASEAN chair, right? So hopefully the Philippines will come in and then followed by Singapore. A lot of exciting work that has been going on. We are definitely trying to reduce fragmentation. So if you think about it, right, it's almost like ASEAN karaoke, right? Everybody has different roles, a soprano, alto, tenor, bass. But our role is to make sure that everyone sings in tune, right, and are in sync. So really, I think that's really the fundamentals of what we're trying to achieve here.
Thank you, Dr. Renard. Very interesting analogy of the karaoke. And thank you for bringing us through this kind of this backstory of how we are here where we are today. If I could go to Kun Gloita, so I think Thailand has been one of the first markets in Southeast Asia to start voluntary carbon trading. This was via the Thailand's Voluntary Emission Reduction or TEVA program, and this started all the way back in 2013. And so, as really the pioneer of our region, I was wondering if you could also share with us what has been some of the biggest change in Southeast Asia that you have observed over the years?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Bursa Malaysia, and thank you, MCMA, for starting this. It's been a year, and I think we've seen much progress as a region, in a sense that, we've seen now we're talking more on ETS, on carbon tax, on carbon pricing, which last year no one mentioned. So as a region, we've come very far, but again, I was just talking during lunch that perhaps we are, a few hundred or a few thousands of people that talk the same language. The biggest challenge is that, there are still perhaps 90% people out there who have very little knowledge about carbon credits, carbon markets, carbon neutrality, net zero. So, raising awareness is one of the most challenging. Even in Thailand, when we started this TEVA, some 10 years ago, the market still being voluntary. So, we haven't seen that much of the volume. I think the strongest volume that we saw was the year on when the Prime Minister went to COP26 and announced the net zero target. That was 2065. Now it's being pushed to 2050. And it's going to be announced publicly at the COP30 with our NDC 3.0. So I think now we are trying to expedite everything, and at the same time, in parallel, we need to really raise awareness among the public at large. So that, for me, would be the biggest challenge. Because once you understand what it's all about, then everything will come forth.
Thank you, Kun Gloita. Yeah. So we've heard so far from one of the pioneers in the region. I was wondering if we could ask Ms. Gingar, who's joining us virtually, if she could share a little bit about the Philippines. So the Philippines is currently preparing and has a lot of efforts in place to build its carbon trading. So going to you, Ms. Gingar, could you share with us a little bit about what are some of the actions that have been taken in the Philippines to prepare for carbon trading?
Yes, thank you very much, Joy. And of course, thank you to the organizers for having us today. I'll be sharing how we're helping to shape the future of carbon markets from a Philippine perspective. Definitely, I could say that our carbon market journey is still emerging, but we do recognize that there's a lot of potential in the Philippines. We have our forests, our mangroves, marine ecosystems, building substantial investments as well in renewable energy and other sectors. And it really makes us a natural leader also in nature-based carbon credits. And these are solutions that help to not just sequester carbon, but also to support biodiversity as well as community development. And perhaps compared to our ASEAN neighbors, we are in the early stages. We're working on draft legislation, early registry, as well as linkages, ensuring our linkages to Article 6. So what have we done so far? I would probably enumerate just very quickly 5 key steps that we have been taking. So one is on the policy and legal framework. We do have legislation drafts on a low carbon investment economy bill. This is already in Congress, and this law will help us to institutionalize a national regulation framework for carbon, helping to define which sectors are covered, threshold levels, allocation mechanisms, compliance rules, etc. While ensuring that the legal framework is robust, we also want to be sure that it's not going to be overly burdensome to both businesses and consumers. And we also still need to address a lot of issues when it comes to overlaps or conflicts with existing environmental and emission laws. A second key development for us in terms of policy is we do know that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources is about to soon release a Department Administrative Order, or what we call the DAO on forest carbon projects. So this is going to give us much needed regulatory clarity and integrity standards in relation to voluntary forest carbon projects, which some Philippine companies have already been working on. And this DAO, I need to mention, is also a shining example of how there's very much this active participation and collaboration ongoing between private sectors. So, for example, our Carbon Coalition and NBS industry groups working very closely with our government actors. We were also recently advised there is going to be an upcoming issuance of an executive order which designates a focal agency for the Philippines that will lead the development and formulation of our Philippine carbon market policy framework. So that's really a big step as well that we are taking in that direction. And then, of course, many active ongoing technical working groups across different agencies and across the private sector that are really helping to support relevant and forward-looking policy design. Another key point that we have been working on is on institutional infrastructure and readiness. So developing our national carbon registry as well as an MRV system. And we know that having this registry is really a key component for the operationalization of carbon markets in the Philippines. Again, there's a lot of collaboration across different agencies as well as active technical working groups that really want to support the work that's ongoing here. The third point, in terms of steps that we're taking, so we're seeing a lot of movement in terms of sectoral pilot implementation. We believe that the sectoral pilots that are already happening in the Philippines are also our own way of how we want to build and test these models, and then take insights from the implementation to form part of the builds towards a comprehensive overarching carbon market policy framework. So, for example, in the energy sector, the DOE is already taking steps perhaps to pilot a carbon trading system for energy. In reforestation, I mentioned earlier that we have the upcoming DAO for forest carbon projects, which are really useful to help guide and monitor these pilots. And will also help to define rules on how the credits are generated, how they are traded and validated. A key component, of course, of doing these pilots is to make sure there's a lot of public consultation and stakeholder dialogues, because it really helps us to refine the design as well as to build trust among stakeholders. There's a lot of stakeholder engagement also that's happening across the Philippines, outreach, capacity building. We want to raise awareness, especially among smaller firms and local governments, as well as local communities, about carbon markets, the co-benefits, right? Because they also have a stake in this, as well as the risks involved in undertaking such projects. And a key aspect for us that's very important is that we need to continue to participate and engage with local and international climate actors. We'd like to learn from economies like Thailand, Malaysia, and the rest of our ASEAN neighbors on how their carbon market experiences are also going. So that engagement and alignment, I think, is really important. Of course, aside from the fundamental international alignment as well to Article 6, we want to make sure that there's compatibility between our domestic registry as well as the global standards, so that whatever credits we can produce domestically can also be recognized internationally. Many other things are happening, but I guess immediately our next steps on this pathway would really be, one, the issuance of the executive order that really helps to set a foundation for institutional arrangements. That's one. Secondly is the finalization of our blueprint for the Philippine Carbon Market Policy Framework. Thirdly is the issuance of that actual framework. And then, of course, very important is the development and enactment of our carbon markets law. So that's where we are currently at right now in the Philippines.
Thank you, Ms. Gingay. So sounds like a lot of things are happening right now in the Philippines. And I think from you and from Kun Goita, what I'm hearing a lot is that there's a lot of efforts right now in various markets to create this very attractive environment that will bring buyers to come and buy carbon credits. And that's also something that Dr. Renat has mentioned. So maybe, Ria, if I could go to you. We've heard a lot about all these efforts, but could you share with us what has been buyers' expectation and appetite for carbon credits recently?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. So I guess when we see the market as potential buyers looking at Southeast Asia as a region, there are still, I don't think it has changed, but there are still two types of markets, right? Talking about the compliance Article 6 market, and let's also talk about the voluntary ones. From the compliance Article 6 markets, we do see that there are progress, especially coming from the APAC region, where Japan, China is actually thinking about how to start enforcing their compliance. Progress such as the JCM collaboration between Japan and countries in Southeast Asia, and even within the Southeast Asian nation, I think congratulations for Singapore and Thailand for signing the implementation agreement as well regarding 6.2. So I guess there is much progress to really show that the Article 6 demand is up and coming. I do think there is an element of time, because it does require some processes, it does require agencies to be set up, and hopefully later we can touch upon what we're going to launch on COP30 to help solve that issues about what methodology to be recognized between countries. So that's hopefully, the intention for us at ACCF is to how to expedite in bridging these differences across countries, right? But now if you touch upon the voluntary carbon market, it is still a quite interesting demand pool to tap into, especially if you're talking about more short term. So we just came back from our trip from New York and really trying to understand what's the appetite of the buyer. It does seem, allegiance towards more high integrity projects, especially for nature, is actually still very, very high, not only with the ICVCM, CCP labels, but also particularly like removal projects as well. So we do see that the region, as Southeast Asia, not only has its natural potential, but actually it's been long awaited. Because if you see the deals right now on removals, they are mainly closing, buyers are mainly closing deals in Latin America, in North America, but not in Southeast Asia yet. So yes, regulatory is one, but it's also about readiness from the projects in Southeast Asia. One thing that was raised actually in the recent last quarterly meeting, which is yesterday, of the ACCF, is basically how can we, two things, how can we bridge more methodology to pass integrity stamp, right? That is very unique to Southeast Asia. So let's not talk about removal only, but let's talk about tropical mangrove removals. Does it have different capability in sequestering rather than other types of species? Let's talk about peatland, right? So let's talk about different types of unique methodology that is need to be presented out there, so then we know why Southeast Asia is much different and why certain methodology needs to be discussed as well. But number two, what we need to talk about is also financing. So a lot of the work that I think ACCF is working with World Bank and a couple of other partners as well is, there's a big demand on removals. There's a big potential supply in Southeast Asia. We have done an analysis on entire Southeast Asia of potential degraded forest to be restored is more than 82 million hectares, and it has the potential to sequester more than 1 billion tons, like what you mentioned, right? But the realization right now is less than 100 million tons of removals from nature-based, meaning that there's a very, very big gap, is because doing removal project is expensive. And when you're talking about Southeast Asia, where the countries are still emerging, private companies are still deciding whether to use the land for productive use, more extractive activity that gives, for example, return of more than 30% every year selling palm oil, compared to looking at, where's the buyer that they can lock for carbon credits. Sometimes, it needs a little bit more hand-holding. So the buyers are there. The question is how we can help them understand more about the potential specifically for Southeast Asia removal, for instance, and how we can bridge the financing so then we can actually channel and do more projects is something that a big topic, and hopefully as ACCF we could also help to facilitate the discussion as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ria. I've noticed that you talked a lot about removals in your answer as well, and this was actually something that I was very keen in because in Southeast Asia we are very known for nature, but not so much known for removals because that's something that's more known in like Latin America, as you mentioned. So, if I could ask you, is there a role in removals in Southeast Asia, and how can we amplify that role?
I do think nature-based removals are a big potential in Southeast Asia. As mentioned, numbers of degraded forests are there. Potential for restorations is a lot, right? So, I think, and feel free to jump in, Anshari. I know he's going to say something after this. It is still necessary to do both removals and reductions, but the market is what the market is. So the question is, how can we tap where the market is today and shape where the larger potential of reductions from nature-based as well. So I guess those, when we're talking about opportunities, we're also talking about momentum and time, and everything takes process, so might as well do things in parallel. So both still needs to happen. It's just where the market is and how we can shape the market further on.
Thank you, Ria. And Anshari, I'm going to bring you into the conversation since like Ria also talked a little bit. We've heard a lot about market movements. We've heard about what each market is doing, but I think another thing that it's always important to kind of understand the role of it is policy. So I was wondering if you could also share with us a little bit. Like, for example, in Singapore, we are the first country in Southeast Asia to have carbon pricing mechanism, and that is Singapore's carbon tax that started in 2019. So Anshari, could you share with us a little bit, what is the role of policy in advancing carbon markets in Southeast Asia?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Congratulations to Bursa for such an excellent organization, an excellent event, and hospitality. And thank you, MCMA, for the invitation. I'm Anshari. I'm from Gen Zero. I'm not from SSFA. We are a member of SSFA, but Gen Zero is an investment firm based in Singapore, and we look at technology, nature, and carbon markets. So we invest in these three pillars. And we do both voluntary carbon market and Article 6. So there are two things that Ria mentioned earlier. One is this interaction between voluntary and compliance, and reductions, removals. And from a policy standpoint, I think that's what we look at in terms of how the host country develops and communicates its policies. What we are looking out for is essentially policy clarity and predictability. And we actually like it when host countries actually develop policies around processes and approvals for the voluntary carbon market. What are the sectors whitelisted for Article 6, what is suitable for voluntary carbon market, because as investors, it gives us clarity on how we structure the project and how we finance the project and what kind of returns we can expect from either voluntary carbon market or the compliance market. Now, the reality is, if you're reading a lot of the publications out there and the forecasts, there is a lot of talk around convergence, right? It's true, right? Likely, the latest forecasts indicate 3/4 of the demand by 2030 is going to come from compliance, whether it's CORSIA, Singapore's carbon tax, or Article 6. But there is actually a very strong role for voluntary carbon market, and we should not forget that the genesis of the role of voluntary carbon market in the Article 6 tax itself is that it can contribute to the host countries' NDC because they do not need to do corresponding adjustment. Right. Of course, in the spirit of negotiations and consensus, things get lost, the message get lost, and things get a bit blurred, but that was the intent. And we can spend a day talking about the accounting aspects. But the convergence is, insofar as the quality is concerned, the permanence, leakage, the quantification aspects, and the reversals, right? But how a host country look at the voluntary carbon market and Article 6 and how it benefits its own local communities, its own policies, mitigation and adaptation. So that was mentioned earlier this morning. So those are the things that I think we look out for. And how we have clarity beyond the immediate term. So we are looking at next NDCs, whether it has communicated their long-term low emissions development strategy, right? How frequent they have submitted their biennial transparency reports under the Paris Agreement. Those are all indicators on how ready a host country is. And I think by and large, there's very good developments in this region. And we are already looking at deploying capital across different projects in this region. So that's on the voluntary and the compliance side. They both play a role. So we have to be careful when we talk about convergence, what it actually means. And it can, both the voluntary and Article 6 can benefit host countries. Now, the other aspect is removals and reductions, right? Both also play a role. When you look at how much removals we need to scale, is to the tune of 100 gigatons from now till 2050 to reach net zero. But in terms of reductions, we need to scale up to about 800 gigatons. So there's a lot that we need to do. And there are a lot of interventions that we can do today which deliver immediate and near-term climate impact. And these are typically your reductions project. So when you look at removals, the tech-based durable removals, they might not be scalable in this region, right? They are costly. For nature-based removals, trees take time to grow, right? So there is a time lag. But there is a role for reductions type projects can play. And here's my broader point, which is on the demand side. We kind of need to collectively work on the demand side, right? We need to ensure that as a collective within ASEAN, we participate in a lot of this international discourse around how rules are being shaped around the use case for carbon credits. I'll give you a couple of examples. SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, is going to release its next version of net zero standard, I think in a couple of weeks. So it is opportune for us as an ASEAN community to look at the interests of this region to see how we can provide input to that process and make sure that our voices are collectively heard, right? And perhaps this is a role that ACCF can play, not just in this forum, but also at COP and beyond, right? ISO is also setting up a net zero standard. And ISO has a layer where governments actually review the net zero standard. So there is a role that agencies looking at the standard bodies can coordinate and provide input such that the national interests are preserved in such international discourse. Because once the ship has sailed, right? And we need to make sure that our voices are heard. But yeah, I think there's a lot to look forward to. The compliance demand is going to be quite strong. CORSIA is the other one, where there is significant potential for this region to activate high quality supply that can supply the CORSIA market.
Thank you, Anshari. Yeah, I really like the point that you mentioned on engaging in international discourse. That's something that we've been talking a lot about as a whole region. And I want to bring in Dr. Riza right over here. So Indonesia, as we've known, is currently in the process of trying to boost international demand for its domestically generated carbon credits. We've seen articles about how the Indonesian government has signed several mutual recognition agreements with international registries like Gold Standard, Vera, Plan Vivo. And as we move forward from kind of taking this landscape overview of how far we've come, I want to move the conversation to what's next. And Dr. Riza, if you could share with us, what are some lessons that you would share with other markets who are looking to do the same as Indonesia?
Thank you, Joy. First of all, I would like to thank Bursa Malaysia for inviting me, Dr. Waini, and the team. I think always been very supportive of IDCTA, and Dr. Reynard also, MCMA. I still remember early this year, last year, we kind of tried to form this ACCF together. So I think there's been so much development. So coming back to your question, I think hearing all the other esteemed panelists have been discussing, expressing their views. Indonesia, in one sense, in the second plenary, I think Pak Wahyu already explained about the development of how the regulations are now taking shape. We are opening up still so many questions about are we still in moratorium? I just had breakfast this morning with Petronas. They said the same questions. Are Indonesia still under moratorium? I said no. We have just recently passed the new presidential decree. I think it's not a revision, but it's a new presidential decree that recognized voluntary market. So I think then a lot of questions also being raised. Are the MRA then can be nullified, or what's the point of signing MRAs while the voluntary markets now already being recognized? No, it's a complementary to each other. I think the MRA is meant for Article 6.2. Therefore, I think this is designed for a compliance market, because it's still, the umbrella of this MRA is still the previous presidential decree, where in Article 77 they recognize MRA for that purpose. Along with that, now the question is what would be the implementation of it, right? So I think this is also the same initiative that I keep and strongly urge and advise our colleagues in ASEAN under ACCF. There's two things that I initiate actually. Number one is we should have a financial alignment support, because to accelerate the carbon market without the financing is impossible. Number two is pilot projects. I think we have so many pilot projects, but I think it's a very complicated demands now. I'm not saying the demand is not there, but it's very complicated. Now with the high integrity issues, we've been so much pressured by the buyers that we should deliver high integrity, high quality projects. But to be honest, I think I have to be honest that maybe among the buyer country, maybe Singapore is the only serious one. I have to applaud them, because I think other countries, including the European, the US, I think they are still unclear whether they are going to have a very solid demand for carbon credits. That's very important, because I think to make this happen, that's why I think if we have this ASEAN coalition, if we can have pilot projects with the demand from Singapore, for example, projects coming from Thailand, from Malaysia, from Indonesia, I think we can have a good, solid example that we can show to the world in ASEAN can do it, because other than that, it will be very difficult to accelerate. Secondly, I think we have also serious demands from Japan and Korea. So I think maybe we can kind of have this pilot on ASEAN Plus, I can say, including Japan and Korea. That probably what can drive and accelerate the whole ecosystem.
If I can just second Parkerisa, I think the priority of ACCF would rather be, trying to balance out first, and Singapore being the biggest buyer, as we know, and Thailand and Indonesia, Malaysia has potential to be, suppliers. If we can match the demand and supply only within the framework, only within the region first, that would be the priority, and then we can go above and beyond. So let's make sure that, Singapore don't go shop somewhere else rather than, among ASEAN countries, please. And as developers, we try to develop high integrity, interoperability, and high quality carbon credits projects. And thanks to Parkerisa again, we are trying to submit more as pilot project to prove that our carbon credits can be of high quality as per the buyer's demand.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add, I think that's exactly what we're trying to achieve at ACCF, right? So, I mean, different countries like Thailand and Indonesia, actually, they've already started with their national crediting schemes. And a lot of people have this tendency of thinking that, automatically, just because it's a national crediting scheme, right, is of low quality, and we're trying to challenge that. So we're, through mutual recognition agreements that Indonesia has taken leadership on, they're really actually signing it with independent standards like RERA, gold standard, and we do have a deliverable where we're trying to see where are the gaps in terms of methodologies, with this whole intention that, we do want to raise the bar, we do want to raise the standard to really align it with international best practices. So the meta standards that you've heard of on ICVCM's, core carbon principles, CORSIA, Article 6, I think these are the sorts of conversations that we're really trying to drive towards quite aggressively. And the pilot projects is actually a core catalyst of the ACCF deliverables. So through Dr. Riza and his team in IDCTA, they have put up their hands and said, we've got pilot projects that we want to run, and what we are trying to agree on right now is what's the criteria to ensure that the projects are truly bankable and also, at the end of the day, tradable, right? So two different concepts, but we want to make sure that it's also aligned to all of the high integrity, high quality principles that we have discussed.
Can I add to that?
And I also interview.
Oh, go ahead.
Please go ahead first. So maybe since we are speaking so much about the demand side, right, in Singapore, I think one of the objectives of ACCF is also to look at harmonization, right? And there must be a common direction towards what is high quality. And we've heard this morning, Amy and the panel, including UNFCCC, PECM, and also don't forget CORSIA is a meta standard as that quality bar, which the international demand is looking at. So I think in terms of the quality supply that can meet the demand, we should not just look at Singapore, right? Because the reality is the demand from Singapore, whether it's compliance or voluntary, is going to be small relative to where the global demand is. And the global demand is looking at CCP level, looking at CORSIA level. And I think we recognize the reality that there are national standards and countries have the prerogative to develop national standards. But what we are looking for, and us as investors, is a pathway towards where these methodologies can actually be recognized and get to CP level, which meets the minimum bar that buyers are looking for. Some buyers might not even look at CCP level, they might look at project ratings, right? So that's another avenue where project developers can look at. Maybe if project ratings firms like B0, Silvera, Calyx can look at individual projects, that could be another avenue. But we have to bear in mind there is a broader flight towards quality, right? And quality is quite subjective and is based on what the international perception is, where the international quality benchmarks are seen.
Yeah, I would add that in Indonesia, from my experience, nature-based projects usually are very highly regulated because I think the government of Indonesia in particular, the Ministry of Forestry, really have a very tight scrutiny, very tight monitoring, auditing, and et cetera. So if you compare that or tandem that with the financial industry, for example, which is a very highly regulated industry as well, I think the questions about high integrity would be answered. Now I think it's a matter of how we can put international standard into the high integrity or highly regulated nature-based regulation in Indonesia. That's just one example. So I think the questions about high integrity, we can put together a good developer, for example, a good investor. If ASEAN, for example, Petronas can be part of the investors and co-develop together with among Indonesian projects, Thai projects, Malaysian projects, I think it can answer everything all together in this whole ecosystem anyway.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing with us that really interesting discussion. I do want to leave some time for the audience to ask some questions, but if I could just ask Dr. Renard, you kick-started this conversation. Could you bring us back and share with everyone what perhaps some things that the audience could look forward to in a month's time at COP30 in the ASEAN Pavilion?
Yeah, I think I kick-started my sharing by talking about the ASEAN karaoke, making sure that all of our players here in ASEAN are in sync and in tune, right? And it goes to show, even things like high integrity, looking at where the gaps are in terms of methodologies. I think one of Ria's project We're not going to share too much now, but I just wanted to say that we are trying to look at opportunities to see where the gaps are in terms of methodologies, where are the shortfalls, and also to see if there are some methodologies within the region, right, can actually go through that pathway, right, of actually achieving, a CCP label. I think there's some work that has been done on that front, although preliminary, but it would be good to be able to validate, the findings from that piece of research. I think going into, from Baku to Berlam, not Balam, right, Berlam, I was told, I think there's a lot to look forward to. I think, we need to celebrate the fact that it's been a year since we've introduced the ACCF, and it's by no means an easy fit. We had a mentioning in the 57 joint statement of the ASEAN economic ministers, which was held in Kuala Lumpur very recently. That in itself, I think, is huge. And there were only two initiatives that were mentioned. One was the ASEAN Business Entity Initiative, and the second one was ACCF. And it's promising if we are to, be serious about the growing a vibrant carbon market ecosystem here. I think ACCF has a lot of huge potential. We're talking about, agreeing on potentially an ASEAN claims guidance, unlocking carbon project financing, looking at mutual recognition of different methodologies, looking at, the legal nature of carbon credits in order to allow, liquidity flow from one country to another, and then building up momentum and capacity. That's really a whole long list, on my wish list that I hope, by the end of our tenure we'll be able to see. But even if it's not, I'm hopeful that, the Philippines and Singapore will continue to take on the baton to drive this forward. And as far as MCMA is concerned, we will continue to be a huge supporter of this initiative.
Thank you, Dr. Renan. I think we have
If I may just add
Yeah.
one, is the digitization. Because Thailand, we are now having this tokenization of carbon credits, and that's another way of adding values. So that can also be added to our wish list, for the region to become a digital hub for carbon credits, if that's possible.
Thank you, Kungloita and Dr. Renat. We have about a few more minutes left. If I would like to give the opportunity to everyone here, as well as joining us online, to ask the panelists a couple of questions if you do have some. Yeah.
Inga?
Thank you for the opportunity. Ingo Pool from South Pole Group. So in ASEAN, we have the first ever Article 6 transaction, now in Thailand, electric buses to Switzerland. We now also have the first bilateral agreement between Singapore and Thailand, and I think Singapore and Philippines. And my question is do you think it's a viable strategy to roll out the ACCF through just a repetition of kind of like the bilateral agreement approach? So we have like so much lessons learned and experience. We actually have a framework, right? So is it not possible through the replication of bilateral agreements to create like a multilateral ASEAN-wide system? Or do we need another approach? And I think that's a question to all of the panelists.
Okay, maybe let me start. Thanks, Ingo, for the question. I think it's a great question. I do think there is something in there to think about, but ASEAN works on the basis of consensus, right? So if you're going to develop an ASEAN framework, I think we are only 1 year old, ACCF. It's probably in the roadmap to see how we can look at integrating this within a broader ASEAN, maybe plurilateral framework. You could see this as a manifestation of what we are talking about the entire day around fungibility and interoperability of markets, right? So perhaps that could be the end outcome. But again, for me, right, as an investor, I would want to see like a common slate of minimum quality bar that we can accept as a region, and one that meets both regional demand but also international demand, and that enhances the entire fungibility of quality supply in the region. I do acknowledge I think through the conversations that we've had last week at IISF in Jakarta and also this week in KL, that there is possibly scope to go deeper into what are the sectors or project types interventions that are quite unique in this region. For for example, peatland or maybe other kinds of sectors, right? And how do we engage some of these international bodies or through the national standards, national methodologies, get them elevated and recognized at the international arena. So Amy's role, Amy being here these few weeks from ICVCM is going to be quite important, and how we bring this forward. Yeah, but that's my short answer to you.
Yeah, maybe I can just respond very quickly as well. The Memorandum of Collaboration that we have signed for ACCF has a period of only 2 years. And just to share a little bit, the idea that you have put out is not new. We have been approached actually by the Guangdong province that actually suggested, oh, why don't we do a South-South alliance? And likewise with Latin America as well. They said, oh, you know, we can potentially grow the pie, right, to actually dominate 70 to 80%, right, of carbon credits that are generated globally. But of course, our priority right now is that we do want to get the other ASEAN member states, right, on board ACCF. We're starting with Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, but don't forget that we also have, you know, like the remaining 10 countries that we need to also get them on board at different stages of maturity. So I would probably think that in terms of, you know, how we are sort of approaching this is prioritization, trying to get them first, clear up ASEAN, and then of course, when the opportunity comes, why not, right?
Yeah, maybe it starts with bilateral agreements, right? You've got implementation agreements with Thailand, Vietnam, hopefully Philippines, and then Indonesia, Malaysia, and the rest will follow suit. And then that's a natural transition into a more plurilateral framework.
Personally, I feel proud already, you know, that we're being recognized at this stage. So I think now that the government's talking to the government, we are talking to one another, and we also talk to the government. So, you know, it's just the beginning, and eventually, I think this will evolve into something that we would dream of. You know, everyone's talking to one another, and that's through one channel, and everyone talk the same language. But I'd rather be a symphony rather than karaoke.
I think we have time for just one more question if anyone would like to ask. No questions? Maybe if I could invite Ms. Gingai, who's joining us virtually, if you could just wrap us off with Philippines taking over the ASEAN chairmanship next year. What is one area of carbon markets that the Philippines is looking to focus on?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Firstly, let me start by saying that we would like to congratulate the ASEAN chairmanship of Malaysia. I think they've done tremendous work, especially for the ACCF. And on the side of the Philippines, since I did mention earlier that it's quite early days for us, we remain very much supportive. We'd like to continue to participate in the conversations and dialogues. But you know, we believe very much in Malaysia championing the you know, all the work that's been going into the ACCF, so on regional interoperability and all the harmonization that's been going on. So maybe that being said, I would suggest that perhaps what Philippines can probably want to spotlight when we take over the ASEAN chairmanship is really more to do on scaling and strengthening the voluntary carbon markets, both in the Philippines and across Southeast Asia, especially trying to improve on the supply side, so meaning on project development, market infrastructure, as well as integrity. And, you know, for us, it kind of makes sense because this leads to building capacity even before we have compliance systems that are ready. It will also help to unlock natural capital that's already there. And then it's also instrumental in responding to the strong demand for nature-based offsets. So we know that many other countries are, you know, still designing or piloting compliance carbon pricing, or perhaps the ETS systems, and perhaps the VCM can serve as a testing ground, pipeline, onboarding space for project developers, validators, and investors. So helping to scale VCM across the region might, help to build capacity, market familiarity, and then also, generates more momentum in the space. We also all know that Southeast Asia really has vast natural resources, projects in conservation, reforestation, blue carbon, peat reforestation, agroforestry. All of these have very strong potential to generate carbon credits. And most importantly, especially for us in the Philippines, we're really looking at carbon projects for the co-benefits that it can generate over time. So really more to do with biodiversity, community development, livelihood, etc. And of course, on the demand side and market maturity, we do know that corporations and financial institutions have to increasingly commit to their own sustainability targets. So there's really this demand being created for credible offsets. So maybe we're looking at Philippines focusing on that. This will have to entail more conversations, of course, with our ASEAN leadership in the Philippines. But again, we remain very supportive and would like to continue participating, especially for the ACCF.
Yep. Thank you, Ms. Ginga. I think it's really heartening to hear that Philippines would like to continue the conversation as well. And so I think right over here, I'd like to thank the panelists and also take the opportunity to introduce to everyone a report that Bloomberg NEF has published. This report looks at some of the issues in carbon markets within Southeast Asia and what are some of the key opportunities and recommendations that the region could tap into to advance our region's carbon markets. So if you guys are interested, please do scan the QR code over here. It's publicly accessible. And you also notice that in the report, in the last chapter, we called Southeast Asia a sleeping giant to really characterize by its large potential, but not yet fully maximized. But I think our conversation here today has really shown that, yes, there's a lot of potential. We are not yet there, but we are working towards it. So could I invite everyone to thank all our panelists here today? Thank you.